Good day, and welcome to this special discussing the recent paper that has been published on my blog, Years of Scotland, on the claim of right. I'm delighted today to have with me my friend and regular contributor to many great articles and discussions about how best to take forward independence in Scotland, and in particular, how to use what's been happening in Scotland over the last 300 years as ammunition. And certainly this week, the claim of right and the explanation of that's proving to be an accelerator, because a great number of people are interested, more and more join all the time. And welcome, Alf, and I hope
Hello,
you're
Iain.
well.
Yes, I'm fine. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. You wrote a great foreword to the paper, and you know it's really been very well received. Where do you think we can take this?
Well, the person that should be congratulated is, of course, Sarah Salyers, who's done all the research into the historical records of the Scottish Parliament, the old Scottish Parliament, going back quite a long time. I think a lot of these records are somehow based in St Andrews University. So Sarah has investigated all that. What it shows is it clarifies really what the claim of right means and what it is and how it can be used and why it's so important in the context of Scottish sovereignty. We've not had this explained to us at all by any of the political class, even by the nationalists, never mind the unionists. And what was really surprising, I think, is that when you look at Article 25 on the treaty, a lot of Article 25 on the treaty in various publications and websites, including UK government, was not there. A lot of it had been removed with reference to the claim of right for many years, and it only recently been put back onto even the government's website for the Treaty of Union. So as obviously the UK government and others on the unionist side didn't want the Scots to know anything about the claim of right.
Well, I always take that as a good sign. When you know people are trying to keep information from you, you know you're not wasting your time if you go looking for that information, because it's a sure sign they recognise the problem, and the claim of right contains so many problems for those who try to dismiss our rights to self-determination. So it's a very encouraging document. It also throws up some amusement. I mean, obviously there's been a bit of back and forth on my blog from people that try to decry it a little bit. And my favourite one was a gentleman who came on and asked me why I put such great store in a document that was from 1689. And I replied to him, well, I preferred it to the document in 1707, largely because there wasn't an army on the border and nobody had been bribed to pass it, But I mean, what I think is, the SNP have been very slow to make progress with this. The SNP should be doing this. It shouldn't be my blog that's publicising all the excellent work. And I completely concur with what you said about what Sarah's been involved in here. It's been outstanding what she's done, an enormous effort. But, the SNP have been aware of it, and to prove that I know they were aware of it, if you look at when the Scottish Parliament first reconvened, and that was the word, Winnie Ewing, chairing that first session, was very explicit to mention that it was the reconvening of the Scottish Parliament.
The Scottish Parliament adjourned on the 25th day of March in the year 1707 is hereby reconvened. couldn't say that until you'd all sworn the oath.
That was sending the clearest signal worldwide that the Scottish Parliament had been in existence. It had just been suspended for the previous period until this new Parliament was created. So, I mean, the SNP were aware of it at that time. I think the problem we've got is we currently have a leadership in the SNP who really would panic if they were told they actually had the power to make us independent tomorrow, but that's my own view. What if it was up to you, Alf, what would you do? Would you be wanting to convene the estates again? Would that be the route you would say?
Well, a lot of this, as you say, Iain, is coming out of the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group led by Mark McNaught, and Sarah Salyers is part of that group, as am I, and various other people have come up with. Actually, there will be, I think, further developments soon on the different options for independence, of which the Convention of the Estates is but one. And I think there will be several options for independence. This is extremely distressing for the independence movement to learn, because the SNP have simply always said there's only one option, and that's the Section 30, which, as we know, is a blind alley. And that's in post-colonial literature. This is as you know, I'm quite a fan of post-colonial theory, and this makes the independence movement. It brings a sickening feeling to them to understand that the independence. The dominant independence party is the people who have put their faith into them only have very limited aspirations for liberation, if any. And this is a real worry. So all the onus now is really on groups like the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group and blogs such as yourselves that bring this information to light for the people, because the mainstream media, as we know, is manket or corrupt. And manket's a great Scottish word because it just means corrupt. But the mainstream media won't tell the people this. We're also into the era of, we're part of this whole educational process where the native in colonialism is never told their history. So we're never told our history. Educationally, we're not told our history. We're not even told our language. So everything about us is made to be inferior. We're unable to govern. We can't speak properly. We have all these weaknesses that colonialism imposes on a native people unjustly, and that's part of the process. That's part of the reason for liberation of a people and independence, and which independence, as you know, in the UN literature means decolonization. So this is what people have to understand about Scotland's reality: is we've been given a bum steer on the claim of right and the treaty for so long. We just don't understand our history. It's all coming out now, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was very interested when I was at school. It was one of the few subjects at school I was genuinely interested, was history. And I learned about the Corn Laws. I learned about the Todpullen martyrs. All English history. I mean, I knew more about Alfred burning the cakes than I did about the Battle of Bannockburn, So, it's not everyone. They even had the Great British Bake Off on the go then. As well. Quite amazing that a country, we must be the only country in the world where our own history isn't taught in our schools. And that's an enormous weakness. And of course, it's exactly tied to what you outlined in your series of papers from your book, Dunhoden, that it's a deliberate policy of the coloniser. They rely on people staying in ignorance. And they treat and try and impose their history, their culture, their lineage on the people, and that's how they hold them down. And it's very subtle, and it takes people like you, Alf, to point it out. And once you see it in front of you, you recognise it happened in your own life. That happened to me. Yeah, that's right. We used to get told off if we spoke Scots at school.
Yeah, it becomes clear as day once you do understand it. Colonialism fundamentally is about economic and political exploitation. I don't think anybody can doubt that Scotland's been subject to that for a guy long time, but it's done culturally and linguistically.
Yeah.
And that's how it's done. We have a culture imposed on us that's not our own. But because people that get on in life tend to, well, in colonial terms, mimic the culture of the oppressor. You have to mimic the culture and the language of the oppressor to get on in life, which is a very unfortunate situation for the millions of Scots that can't do that necessarily or didn't want to do it. So that's why we have a lot of inequality and deprivation and still poor infrastructure and all the rest of it. But essentially, with colonialism, you end up with an underdeveloped nation and an underdeveloped people. And that's why we need independence. Independence then becomes liberation, the liberation of the people to do as they wish with the resources, which include the people themselves. And there's a lot of people in Scotland that we have to lift up. We actually have to lift up a lot of people and give them opportunities. With colonialism, of course, what you're doing is you're giving all the best opportunities to the colonizer.
Exactly, that's what's been happening. That's why so many top Scottish jobs are advertised in the Times of London.
And I saw it in the universities big time, of course, where my own analysis of departments at most of the elite universities in Scotland found that Scots only make up about 1 in 10 of the academics. So 90% of the academics are brought in. And we weren't training enough of our own people to do PhDs to become academics. We weren't giving them the opportunities. What we were doing was bringing in elites that could pay the big fees to do the jobs. And then, of course, eventually Scottish universities just seem to be run by Oxbridge, whether it's St Andrews, Edinburgh, whatever. And then we lose really everything about our country in that sense. It's when colonialism really puts a country's culture and ambition on hold, and its people are left pretty much rudderless in that sense. And that's probably where we have the situation just now. We're pretty leaderless in that sense. We have the Sturgeon group running things, but they don't have any. With colonialism, of course, it tells you the theory that the national government, if it's a dominant national government, basically behaves like a gang. It feathers its own nest, it builds up its pensions, and it holds back independence and liberation. And it does that because it's entered into some kind of alliance, unwritten or whatever, with the colonial power. And that's why it's holding back independence. And that's why we see new independence parties like ALBA and the others developing. That's what happens in the post-colonial theory. The template tells us all this happens. And the people then have to understand that they've been duped, and they have to then move rapidly towards the new independence parties and understand what opportunities exist there, which is where we're talking about with the claim of right.
Well, I always, I first entered or joined the SNP. Gordon Wilson was the leader, and Gordon was neither left nor right. Gordon was a true nationalist. He wanted to see independence for Scotland, and it wouldn't have mattered, who he was upsetting or where he was going. If he could have made use of the claim of right at the time, unfortunately, for most of his time as leader, he was the only, or sometimes 50% of the SNP representation. There was no Scottish Parliament at the time, and anything he had to do was through Westminster. And we all know how hard it is to make any impact down there, given their rules and conditions. But Gordon was, someone who would have driven, an issue like the claim of right, who would never have ever contemplated any issue other than independence for Scotland being the number one issue. In other words, he wouldn't have been bothered about GRA or self-ID or any of the rest. He may have had a concern for it, don't say he wouldn't have, but it would never have ever assumed the importance within the party structure that Nicola Sturgeon has allowed. I mean, independence has become secondary in the SNP, and that's a huge problem. But one of the heartening things, I think, from this expose of the content of the claim and right is the level of shock it's created, with a lot of people who are genuinely committed to independence, but who knew nothing of this. And again, this comes back to the colonisers' view of history and of knowledge. They have no interest in promoting this. You will not read a column inch in the mainstream media about this because it's in their interests to keep Scots ignorant of things like this, of our history, of our rights, or how our rights have been removed from Scotland. So, I'm very hopeful that we've raised the temperature here and that from now on, anytime the SNP head towards delay, they're going to hear nothing but the claim of right and why aren't you using this route? And I completely concur with you, Alf, that the SSRG have a great opportunity to push this agenda further, because a lot of what, Mark and the others have been doing is crucially important. And the more ammunition we can give yes activists, the more we'll make progress. And it's getting independence back on the agenda in the #1 spot. That's the way forward. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. The other thing, the point you were making about Gordon Wilson is very valid, because the post-colonial theory tells us that the most important thing for the people is liberation. Independence is not a matter of left or right policies or central policies or policies and this and that and everything else. It's really the fundamental priority initially is the freedom and liberation of the people. And that's the priority. So the SNP's focus on all these other policies is what's regarded in post-colonial theory as mystification policies, which a dominant national party bring in to make it look busy. But it's actually, a lot of these additional policies are really about further repression of the people, as we've seen. And so they're not very nice policies either. So it's holding back the independence movement. It's also attacking the independence movement. It's actually working. It's working on for the other side, basically, and that's what happens in the template. So we see that happening with the regime as it currently is. It's basically behaving like a colonial system. But I think that fundamentally what we see with the claim of right information that's being provided now is that it clarifies really the sovereignty of the Scottish people. And it also minimises the role of the politicians, in a sense. The actual claim of right demonstrates that the people can dismiss a government that violates the people's rights.
Yeah, you can see why it wouldn't be an attraction to someone like that.
Well, this is it. The SNP has totally failed to deliver after 6 majorities, and 3 in Westminster, 3 in Holyrood, to deliver independence. They've had 6 majorities, but they've failed to do that, even notwithstanding the successive violations of the treaty. So, in a sense, the people have instructed the SNP to act on their behalf, but the SNP have refused to act. But the people actually, within the claim of right, have the power to dismiss a despotic government, or monarch, in fact. So, but the question really to be clarified, and the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group and Sarah and others are working on this, is how that can be brought together in the Convention of the Estates, through the Convention of the Assemblies of the People, how this sovereignty can be managed and demonstrated in a fair and democratic way. So there's other work to be done here to clarify that. And people who have mentioned some reservations on claim of right are right to do so. But I think we have to look at the claim of right in the modern context, how this can be managed, how the people's voice can be heard. And that can surely be done. I remember going to Canon Kenyon rights meetings of the Constitutional Convention, a different setup back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and that was a great experience as well for me, learning how the people can come together with a voice, and that was cross-party to a large extent. It was also with the trade unions, the churches, the other groups. And we know that in the treaty, this Article 25 is so important with the claim of right, because it also illustrates the importance of these other groups, such as the church, the universities, and others who were given status and privileges, as was the Scottish legal system. And I think that's another part that's really important here, is the Scottish legal system and how it views itself within this context of sovereignty. Bear in mind that one of the key things that we have to remember, I think, in the Scottish judiciary has not been involved in treaty matters for 300 years. So we don't have, we're pretty thin on the ground for constitutional lawyers in Scotland, as far as I can see. And that's largely a function of we've not been dealing with Scotland's treaties for 300 years. It's all been done through England and England's laws. So we have that knowledge to gain again about our own. That's why we've lost our knowledge about our constitution, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned Canyon Kenyon right, because, you know, I'm very aware there was a much more modern claim of right, which was the 1989 version, which was part of that process. And I don't think it's any, you know, coincidence that you had that development of whatever you want to call it, the Constitutional Convention coming together, all these bands all coming together, the SNP outside it, but quite wisely outside it in my view, because they were basically saying, if you don't get this right, you're going to pay a big electoral price because we're not going to take it. And of course it got delivered. And, you know, it's the last time I can think of where Scotland made genuine political progress. And that was because they were actually not calling it, well, they were calling it the claim of right, they made it 1989, but using those tactics delivered within a decade. You know, how long have we been trying to take it on from that time? A lot more than a decade, several decades. So, you know, returning to a claim of right style tactical board seems to me a very good idea. What I worry about, and this will maybe make you laugh, I worry about it being too successful. Boris is looking and saying, they're getting organised up there, I better do something to kill it. And what would Boris's tactic be? I think it would be, hello Nicola, come and see me. I've got a gold standard here waiting for you, because he would rather have her head up any future Yes campaign than the people head up any Yes campaign. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the race might be on, because I don't personally see Nicola ever being attracted to the claim of right argument. If you think about it and look at Nicola's style is Nicola. She must be the figurehead. And even within her own party, even within her own cabinet, anyone that rivals her gets cut off and the legs taken away from them and they're removed. So she's never going to be attracted to a policy which says the people are sovereign, the people will determine this. She likes being the mini dictator. So, you know, I don't see much future with Nicola, which is sad, because, I mean, she was given a God-given opportunity to be the person to deliver independence. When Alec handed over to her, the SNP, the Yes movement, had never been in better shape, and all the momentum. Look at the result in the 2015 election, and why she, a few weeks beforehand, said the vote wasn't going to be about independence. Why? The polls were showing it was going to be a runaway victory, you know, and we delivered 56 out of 59 MPs. The glorious opportunity that it was. I questioned even then why she did that, and I think the pattern since then makes me increasingly believe she's not on our side, Alf. That's the problem.
Yeah, well, I think the three successive majorities, Scotland majorities in favour of independence, it was surely enough, even with the claim of right information we have now, for a convention of the estates to be set up, including not just the MPs, but also MSPs, councillors, other groups of Civic Scotland and individuals as well. That was the time, and that still is the time to do this. It's not difficult to do, to set up a convention of the estates, an assembly of the peoples, as it were, to look at these things, especially in light of Brexit and other violations of the treaty. And Scotland essentially is being dragged here and hither by the Tories, who most Scots never vote for. So we have a democratic deficit. We still have the democratic deficit we had when Canon Kenyon Wright was talking about it. We still have it, but we also have this additional barrier as a nationalist administration and elected government holding back the independence movement. and paying lip service to the actual treaty itself, the Treaty of Union, which provides the mechanism for Scotland to withdraw from the treaty. If a treaty's been violated, then the signatory party to that treaty has an obligation and a right to withdraw from it. We have majorities of elected politicians, nationalist politicians in Westminster and in Holyrood in Scotland that are in favour. Ostensibly, they claim to be in favour of independence, but they're not asserting that sovereignty that the treaty and the Act of 1689, the claim of right, gives them the right to do, and they're not testing that. They should be if they're uncertain about it, they should at least be testing it. You know, if any of it, there's probably plenty of independence campaigners would stand for election for the SNP or any national party with the commitment under vetting that they would assert that sovereignty, and that's what. You know, we've elected politicians that the first thing they do is set up constituency offices and bed in, like Labour used to do. But what we need in independence is not a normal political party with the usual British kind of design of political party structure and so on. What we needed was an independence movement party that represents the people in that sense, to deliver independence as the fundamental. So these politicians that we've elected don't seem to understand what they were there to deliver, to do. They were not there to set up constituency offices and to argue on this, that, and the next thing. They were there to deliver independence, and they have the mechanism to do that with the treaty and the claim of right, but they're just ignoring it all.
Yeah, I think the sad thing is that they've allowed this cult of personality politics to, gain ascendancy. And instead of having a collective leadership across the board where the Yes movement had many spokespeople, and several different arguments on the go at the one time, it's been allowed to develop into, a one-person position, where Nicola exercises full control over everything and nothing goes out. I mean, I have friends, shall I say, who are members of the Scottish Parliament and indeed in the Westminster Parliament, who tell me how the system works. And they all pay into a fund, which is supposed to fund the press office and all the rest. But once the money's in, the money doesn't get spent on all the members of Parliament. The money gets spent on very select group of the members of Parliament directed by Nicola. And if a member of Parliament, believe it or not, wants to put out a press release, he has to get clearance from these offices before they can do it. So, it's controlled from the top very, very strictly. And as you've seen with incidents like Joanna Cherry, if you start showing any promise, I mean, let's remember here, Joanna Cherry defeated the British government. How would we much love to see that happen more often? But her reward was to get removed from the front bench because she was becoming a star, and she was replaced with student of interpretive dance, and Westminster's been running circles around her ever since.
Yeah, well, my biggest worry was when the 56 were elected back in 2015. I was actually flabbergasted they didn't withdraw Scotland from the treaty then, to be honest.
Yes, exactly.
What immediately struck me was would they still turn up if there was 59 nationalists elected? If every single seat in Scotland was a nationalist politician claiming to want independence, would they still go to Westminster and give their oath there and leave the Scottish people without their sovereignty again? So I couldn't understand this, and what immediately came to mind was that they're not behaving like nationalists. And this goes back to the issue about, do they understand what independence means? Do they know what nationalist politicians are supposed to do? And I think they've lost the focus here, and they don't really understand, I don't think, what independence is. And of course, in the UN definition, it's decolonization. Now, they won't mention the colonization word, the C word, because I don't know, they don't think Scotland is decolonizing. They don't think Scotland's a colony, but Scotland has all the characteristics and features of a colonial entity. Its economic exploitation, its political control is outside, its culture is imposed, its language is deprived. We don't teach our Scots language to the bairns in school. We can't even deliver our own language, never mind a ferry. So in my view, they don't understand. These politicians are almost like Labour. They're almost like the feeble 50 that we used to decry and send into Westminster every 4 years or whatever. And we knew that they would get nothing. We would get nothing out of them, but that was it. But they're like that. They've transformed from nationalists. In fact, reading some of the literature recently on Ukraine, they've transformed from nationalists, I would say, into liberalists, towards liberalism, which is actually pro-imperialism, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's anti-nationalism. So this is why they don't mention the nationalist word anymore. They don't mention independence much either. But their focus is completely changed. Their priorities are now, as you see the policies and the laws coming through Holyrood, and the rhetoric coming from the front bench in Westminster, it's all liberalism. It's not nationalism. They've traded nationalism for liberalism. As far as I can see, that seems to be the prevailing political ideology has changed.
Well, I think Nicola's made clear in the past she would never describe herself as a nationalist. And,
Yeah, well,
you know, to be fair to her, I wouldn't describe her as one either.
no.
So, I mean, the great hope here, Alf, is that people who are attracted to reading this series become more interested in colonialism, become more interested in the history of their own country, and that they speak about it openly with their friends and colleagues, because there's no better education than conversation between friends, and people learn from that, become enthused by it, start doing things about it. And that's what we need to do. We need to re-energize the entire Yes movement. I remember those heady days of 2014 and the genuine excitement that people felt, and everybody wanted to get involved. I toured the country with Jim Sullers in the back of the Margomobile, and we went into these schemes and we offered people genuine hope. And it was no coincidence that it was those schemes that were amongst the strongest supporting yes vote in the referendum, because these were people that had been forgotten, that had been written off, and here they were hearing a message that gave them hope, maybe sometimes not for themselves, but certainly for their children. And that's what we must get back to. I remember an SNP that campaigned on independence, but it also campaigned on jobs, on housing, and all the key issues that affect everyone in the country. I never recall and don't believe it would have been possible in those NECs and that party leadership ever to get involved in all these fringe, as you say, liberal issues, which have got absolutely nothing to do with driving independence forward. So,
yeah, I think that's right.
It's just we need to change the priority.
Yeah, and the other thing about the colonial reality is what happens in this decolonization process, if you like, is that the bourgeoisie tend to dominate things. So the working class are basically even more marginalized, if not more oppressed, through laws that come in. But the bourgeoisie tend to still exploit their position. And we have to remember that colonialism is always that cooperative venture between the native elite, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and to some extent, and the colonial power. And that's the alliance that we're fighting against, in a sense. That's the barrier to progress to some degree. So there is a cultural difference, a linguistic difference here, but it's also structural in society, that we have a cultural hegemony which controls things in colonial terms that we have to come to terms with. And this is what the politicians seem to have lost track of, really what independence is about, why it's absolutely essential. And the other related thing to this is that we have to remember, without control over without sovereignty or sovereignty being asserted, we have no control over what happens to our nation, our lands, our seas, our people, and our borders. And the big concern I have now is that demographics may fundamentally alter the possibility for independence if we continue along the same path. Because remember that the colonial power is always working to change the population in his favour. And we see that with Northern Ireland. We've seen it in many other places as well around the world, where the colonial power will always use population change and shift to strengthen his position. And that's increasingly what we see in Scotland, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm very aware of that as well. It features in my blog regularly, thanks to you and others as well. And I think we need to be more imaginative as well. I mean, if you take a recent example, we heard about the SNP's new 10-year plan, and, there was some decent stuff in it, but as you all know, 10 years in economics is a lifetime. But it would have been much more effective if it had been published by saying, well, here, if we stay part of the British state, here's what we hope to be able to do in the next 10 years. And here alongside it, as if we're independent, here's what we could do in the next 10 years. And provide people that contrast to let them see the difference from being subjugated as part of a colonial process as opposed to being free, and then let them choose. That's the way we should campaign.
Yeah, the post-colonial theory is very clear on this, and Scotland fits this like a glove, in that the economy has largely been set up over a long period to serve the needs of the core power, core power, which is England and its empire. That's what Scotland was set up. So it had a very narrow industrialised specialisation, and you know that through your work in the steel industry and promoting other aspects as well. So we had this very narrow industrial specialisation, which was very subject to shocks. Historically, our GDP was also lower, our unemployment was higher, our out-migration was higher. We had all these colonial legacies, but we also had what comes with internal colonialism, of course, is a cultural division of labour. And that cultural division of labour, as we know in Scotland, is particularly Anglophone, where we have elites that run our institutions, our organisations in general. And the Scots tend to be marginalised in this kind of reality. So we take on, we are subject to these kind of constraints. And that essentially is another requirement for liberation of the people, the freedom to have these opportunities that most other countries, people in certainly the Nordic countries like Denmark and Norway and so on, take for granted, as they have the opportunities available to them, whether it's their universities, whether it's running their institutions or creating new businesses and industries. They have these opportunities available. We are constrained because our whole economy is focused on really just supporting the core nation. That's why we don't have any of these ferry connections to the continent, where Ireland's got 40 a week or something. We've got no ferry connections anywhere. So even Faroe Islands has got a connection to Denmark, but we didn't have any. And as somebody who worked in shipping and researched shipping for many years, I can see that we are an underdeveloped country. We are like a less developed country in maritime trade sense. We are like some perilously exploited land somewhere, anywhere else. But we don't envisage that. We don't seem to understand, when we look at the dereliction of our major ports and the Clyde and the Forth and the Tay, we don't understand that there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. Our international trade has not been prioritized. It's all our resources are focused on serving the needs of the core nation. And that means it also extracts all these resources cheap and sells them back to us dear.
Yeah, so exactly.
And that's the economic plunder, the colonial plunder. We're selling all our energy cheap, and we've got loads of energy. We could be selling that to the continent and making a fortune out of it.
Well, I think it's quite instructive, Alf, that Boris Johnson visiting Saudi Arabia yesterday was lambasting the rest of Europe for being so dependent on Russia's oil and gas. And he concluded by saying, what we need is independence.
This is exactly. Yeah.
And for the first time, I agreed with him. It's exactly what we need. Look, Al, thanks very much for this interesting discussion as always.
Thank you.
Hopefully, we've enthused a few more folk to take an interest in Scottish politics, and in particular, the claim of right, which is still more publication, more articles to publish this week. But once again, thanks, Alf. You're a joy to talk to. It always cheers me up.
You too, Ian. Thanks very much.
And thanks to Scott News in Denmark for hosting this programme. Wonderful.
I would like to end by quoting from the debate of 1707, and I've chosen a passage from Lord Belhaven, who was an opponent of the treaty, and this is what he said then. Show me a spurious patriot, a bombastic fire-eater, and I will show you a rascal. Show me a man who loves all countries equally with his own, and I will show you a man who lacks any sense of proportion. But show me a man who, while he respects all countries equally with his own, yet is ready to defend the rights of his own against them all, and I will show you a man who is both a nationalist and an internationalist. 1707 was said to be, was it not, the end of an old sang? Well, we all here together can begin to write a new Scottish song, and I would urge all of you to sing it in harmony fortissimo. Thank you.